Hi everyone, thank you. Thank you, Roger. Charlie, for having me again. Last year, Charlie had a Jeopardy competition, which you might remember, which was open to CEOs, which I'd remind everybody I won, actually. My main objective of the day was to beat my then boss, Jack Clues, which I managed to do. And Charlie, in his normal way, said, I'm going to give you a car if you win the competition. And then at the end of the competition, to my obvious disappointment, a little plastic motorized car appeared on stage. I can tell you I never even received that little car. That somehow disappeared in the post. And then Charlie said, don't worry, we're going to invite you back next year, Steve, as long as you promise to come, 2013 in Montreux, and we're going to have the same Jeopardy competition again, and there will be a real car to be won. Instead, I see on the agenda I've been preempted off the Jeopardy competition. I'm now being given the task of presenting the rather more difficult ad spend forecasts. As Roger said, we've actually been doing this in the guise of Zenith for some 25 years. We were the first media agency, which Roger will remember, setting up in London. And one of the first things we did was set out to sort of track global ad spend. And our business has changed, obviously, considerably. I'll come back to that later. When we set up, we were actually called ZenithOptimedia Buying Services Limited. And that's all we did. We did buying, and we were very limited in what we did. And I'll come back to that later, because I think it's the previous speakers, I think, have sort of shown the way that our business and the way that our relationship with our consumers and clients is really changing. But if we look at this 25-year history, you can see there's a very close correlation. It doesn't matter whether we look at consumer confidence, corporate profitability, or in this case, the relationship between ad spend in yellow or GDP in red. You can see how there's a really close correlation. Broadly, ad spend exaggerates the economic cycle. So when the economic cycle declines, you'll see that ad spend sort of exaggerates the level of that decline. There have been 3 significant downturns, all of which I obviously remember. The early 90s with the oil crisis, you'll see that small dip. That very short, sharp shock, which happened with the collapse of the dot-com businesses in the beginning of the last decade. And then, of course, the most significant downturn, which happened 2009, the end of last decade, with the banking crisis, debt crisis, which we all know about. It's fair to say not only that was more severe, the recovery for that is going to take much, much longer, and has had a much larger effect on the way that we operate around the world. The good news, and there are some really significant signs for optimism that I'm going to share with you today, probably I would say 3 significant signs of optimism. The first is there is a steady recovery in global ad spend. To coincide with this, we've just launched this morning our new global ad forecast. We release these quarterly, and we do this for about 110 markets around the world. So 2013, we're seeing a market which is recovering slowly. 518 billion we're predicting this year in terms of total global ad spend. You'll see that rate of increase is marginally increasing to 2014, something like a 5%, and then 2015, we're predicting a global ad spend, total spend of some 574 billion, a 5.6 rate of increase. So you'll see a slight, steady increase in the rate of growth. Now, there are 3 factors that I mentioned that are determining ad spend. GDP, and we've seen already that historical trend. Interestingly, ad spend is actually tracking marginally below GDP at the moment. Corporate profitability, that is not the issue or problem that most people think. Corporate profitability is actually very high. If you take a market like the UK, there's something like 185 billion in cash reserves in the FTSE companies. You take the US, the level of profitability is something like 12% against GDP. And that's the highest level since the mid-1940s. So corporate profitability is not the issue. It is, of course, how those companies are spending that profitability and deciding to invest in it. The third issue is one of consumer confidence, and I'm going to deliberately come back to that in a few slides' time, because clearly there's huge disparity amongst the different regions around the world. And that disparity is marked in terms of the new forecast that we're predicting. And what we've started to do over the last couple of years, rather than looking at sort of neat geographical blocks, what we've tried to do here is to actually look at those markets which become clustered together by similar economic activity and similar level of trends in ad spend. And to simplify, and obviously all of the data is available through us, but just to sort of summarize the top line, we've classified into 3 different regions. The firstly is those which are fast growth. So in these cases, these are the 4 regions where we're seeing more than 20%. This is from 2012 to 2015. So we're seeing the strong recovery in Middle East after the disruption, political unrest in that region. Secondly, we're seeing fast-track Asia. So these are the markets like India and China, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, including Russia, and then LATAM at 37. So all of these 4 regions, these cluster of 4 markets that we've clustered here, growing between 20 and 40%. Marginal decline in our forecast for fast-track Asia, but more than compensated for that continued vibrancy that we're seeing in LATAM. The second set of region markets of those which we've called steady growth. Here we've got the much more traditional markets like Northern and Central Europe. So these are markets like France, Germany, UK, Nordics, and they're going to grow at about just under 5% over the next 3 years. We've got North America, and I'll come back to consumer confidence, but you see much stronger, much more consistent growth predicted out of what is obviously still and will remain throughout the whole of this period the world's largest ad spending market. Japan recovering with the revaluation of its currency, recovering from the tragedies of 2 or 3 years ago. It's a very slow level of growth. And advanced Asia, which is markets like Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore. So you'll see across we've got 2. They've got the fast growth, steady growth. Of course, the laggards, and I apologize for the people living in these economies, which are those markets unfortunately summarized as the Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece and Spain, or the PIGS to give its unfortunate acronym. And despite the level of decline slowing, we are still seeing some further decline, both this year, 2013, and through the end of our period. These markets still very much suffering from the economic crisis, pressures on them from the Eurozone, see some further pain still to come. So globally, the region where we see the most significant pain continuing is in the Eurozone. This will surprise, I'm sure, nobody here. We've seen these PIGS markets decline by something like 15% last year. Those markets will decline by 6.5% this year. We've obviously got the continued pain of the austerity measures, and there's a great piece in today's FT, which I'll refer you to, where there's this increasing challenge about these austerity measures. Are they in the medium term to long term? Are they actually going to re-stimulate the growth in these economies? Because the evidence is clearly that these austerity measures pushed by these Austerians, and that's contrasting with these other group called the Spendanigans, who are trying to encourage spending in these economies. Now, out of these economies where we're obviously seeing some really huge seismic shifts, I remember back in 2009, economists were talking about the length of the time of this decline, and they were saying that a recession that's wrought by an excess of debt generally will take at least 10 years to fully recover. And I think the evidence, particularly in these markets here, that seems to be a prediction that could be believable. If we look at how this is shifting the global map, there's been a real acceleration of the global top 10 markets. US, Japan, China, and Germany, again, this is up to 2015, retain their 4 leadership positions. But you'll see that markets like Brazil and Russia, which wasn't even in the top 10, coming in. You'll see the UK and France declining as they suffer from being in part of the Eurozone. So a real shift in terms of the economic pivoting that's happening around the key markets that are contributing to global growth. I mentioned at the beginning consumer confidence, and we've worked with Nielsen here, and I think you can see how that shifts. So we've taken the same categorization of markets, and you've got those sort of strong pessimism. This was research that was done in the 3rd quarter of last year, the latest research available. But as you can see, if we look at those same geographical blocks, you've got a level of confidence indexed against 100 of only 47 on the peripheral Eurozone or the PIGS markets, Japan, advanced Asia, moving into Northern and Central Europe. And then quite surprisingly or reassuringly, North America, that amazing resilience of the US consumer. You can see that North American is the closest to the confident. And then you see on the right-hand side, those which are above the 100 indices in terms of Middle East and North Africa and fast-track Asia, including India and China. So we've got some real disparity in terms of how what's happening. And of course, what we're seeing is a real shift in terms of what's happening within that as those fast-track markets, they no longer can rely on growth for exports to the struggling Asian and American markets. So they are looking to grow their internal consumption. They're doing that by programs in terms of urbanization, in terms of building, in terms of infrastructure. We're seeing a very different shift in terms of how the economic pattern and level of investment is changing, depending upon how the long-term prediction of consumers is changing. And then what we see is this change in for us, in terms of the consumers which we're trying to reach. And here we've categorized some of the largest markets, those fast-track markets. So we've got some of the LATAM markets, Brazil, Argentina, India. And we can see across those markets, we can see a real shift, so a 9% improvement in their disposable income between 2005 and 2010. So that's adjusted for inflation. If you didn't do that, that would be something like closer to a 50% increase if inflation wasn't excluded from this analysis. So what we're seeing here is we have got new consumers, rapid levels of disposable income. We are seeing a huge change in the way that they are consuming, moving out of pure necessities. We're obviously seeing consumers moving towards more aspirational products, moving towards global brands, and consumer brands and global brands actually being an expression of self-confidence by consumers in those markets. Very different, obviously, if we look at the ongoing behavior that we see in some of the more mature markets, including Western Europe, Americas, etc. This is obviously still the dominant consumer group. The vast proportion of consumers that we're still going to reach, 2/3, are still within these regions. These are markets which are characterized by higher debts, declining savings, poor levels of long-term employment, rising housing costs, and consequently, these consumers are taking on very different patterns and a real shift towards value purchasing of products. And rather than building up global communities, they're looking for local connections, which in terms of drive value through their everyday shopping. So very different shift in terms of depending upon where these consumers are living. I mentioned at the beginning the signs for optimism. One of those, of course, is our slow uptick in terms as we come out of the very painful recovery. The second, and we've seen this highlighted in the previous presentations, a real dynamism, a certain part of our business. I think everybody is broadly aware that TV and its various manifestations across multi-screens has remained relatively constant over the last 10 years, as indeed has out-of-home, as indeed radio. But what we're seeing is online display continuing to grow and will continue to grow at about 20% per annum. So real underlying dynamism here with no diminishment in terms of the rate of growth. Particular categories to call out is obviously social at 28%, online video at 32%, and paid search, which is moving away just from the classified, the pull advertising that Roger mentioned in his introduction, now looking to more branded advertisers moving into paid and organic search. So really strong levels of growth consistently across the various avenues in terms of online display. And then if we look at how people are spending their time and how that is tracking against advertising expenditure, you'll see that there's perhaps the first two are not too surprising. So if you look at the amount of time spent, and we've taken this from the US, which is probably the most reliable market to do this analysis, but the same, I'm sure, would be for any market. that if you look at the time spent, something like 2/3 of all time is spent with traditional media, and traditional media accounts for about 80% of total ad spend still in the US. If you take the fixed internet, about 1/4 of all time is spent with the fixed internet, and you can see there's a slight time lag there. 18% of all ad spend in the US is via fixed internet. You'll notice that the anomaly is at the bottom, which is in mobile. So about 12%, and I'm sure our friend Frank from BlackBerry will agree that more than 11% of all time is spent on mobile. But you'll see that there is a significant anomaly on these numbers, whereas less than 1%, and I'm sure that's the case globally, less than 1% of global ad spend is currently recorded through mobile. Of course, what we're looking at here is ad spend, not, of course, if we're looking at paid, and obviously much of owned and earned will be excluded from this analysis. So what have we got? We've got a very different consumer today. We've got a consumer that is always on, is multitasking, and is expecting their brands to be accessible 365 days a year. I think those previous case studies have really talked about how advertisers are now using this medium and these consumers in an entirely new way. And it shows why the value of always having this continual engagement. I thought that Itaú example from Brazil was fantastic, as was the BlackBerry. And I was with one of our leading clients last week who gave me the hypothesis that copy is dead. It's about continuous conversation. It's about developing continuous conversations, the ability to develop self-expression for these consumers. And I thought that Itaú case really made that in terms of using these different platforms in a really engaging way, a really different opportunity in way in which we communicate. And in terms of the smartphone, the reason why that is so important is 81% of all purchasing on commerce, going from content to commerce, 81% is done on impulse rather than planned, which shows the importance of having that continuous expression or continuous conversation with consumers. And I thought I would just finish with two very final slides. These are not meant to be advertisements for ZenithOptimedia, but they are talking about the very different work that we're doing for our advertisers and our clients. So I mentioned at the beginning that 25 years ago, we were Zenith Media Buying Services Limited, and I've got some of the examples of work we are doing, and I know that all of our other communication investment agencies working on behalf of clients are doing very similar work, and that's the work that's going to be awarded during the judging next couple of days. So for us, we've done films, for example, in China for HTC, developing TV programs, creating special one-off events like we did for Carlsberg in China, a social campaign that we did in the Nordics, the launch of a Renault campaign that many of you were seeing at Cannes last year, which we did for Renault, and the sponsorship of an event that we did behind the Tel Aviv Marathon. So a very different way for us engaging with our consumers, developing really deep relationships, leveraging this real change in the dynamism in the market. And finally, again, this is not meant to be an advertisement for our network, but I think it's probably a sign perhaps to be optimism for everybody here. If you take, this is just taking the period over the last 10 years, looking here, we've got the market and GDP. You can see how those two trends have tracked, and then that's our own growth, and again, I know it would be the same if you go back last 10 years, every single one of the leading global media agencies has more employees than it had 10 years ago. And I think this just shows how we are getting increasing confidence and sitting much more at the heart of the consumer's challenges, exploiting the new technology opportunities that come both with the consumer and with brands. Thank you very much.